Alrighty, so firstly, I just want to say a massive thank you for joining me in this free photography training where we're going to be covering the key camera settings that you need to understand to start taking professional looking photos with any camera. And this video was actually taken from my new photography accelerator course, which has been designed to take a complete beginner who has never held a camera to someone who can take photos like this in just 7 days. So without further ado, let's jump into the training. So today we're going to be covering some pretty basic stuff, but I'd say that the majority of people who own cameras don't fully understand these basics, which leads to unprofessional looking photos. So even if you think you have a grasp on these, pay attention because you just may learn something new. So for day one, we're going to be covering camera settings. So no matter what camera you have, whether that be a Sony, a Canon, a Nikon, an iPhone, whatever it is, in order to achieve professional looking photos, you have to be using the correct camera settings. So firstly, let's cover exposure. And simply put, exposure means the brightness of your image. And there are 3 key settings that control our exposure. And that is shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So let's break these 3 settings down, starting with shutter speed. So shutter speed is the number that is displayed in the bottom left hand corner of your camera, and simply put, this controls the time it takes for your camera's shutter to open and close to capture an image. So that means the higher your shutter speed, the quicker your camera will capture an image, and the slower the shutter speed, the longer it'll take your camera to capture an image. And depending on how fast you set your shutter speed, this will determine how much motion blur will be in your photo. So that means the lower the number, the more motion blur you'll see in your images, and also the brighter your image will become. The higher the number, the less motion blur you'll see, and the darker your image will become. So for example, if you were shooting things like sports, portraits, or animals, then you'll want to use a higher shutter speed to ensure you are freezing your subjects. But when doing something more creative like long exposures or panning photography, then you'll want to use a slower shutter speed to capture more motion blur in your images. And as a rule of thumb for most cases, your shutter speed should be set to a minimum of double your lens's focal length. So for example, if you're shooting with a 50mm lens, then your shutter speed should be set to a minimum of 1/100th of a second. If you're shooting with a 200mm lens, then your shutter speed should be set to a minimum of 1/400th of a second. And the reason we do this is to ensure we don't have any camera shake in our images. So you may be asking, what is camera shake? And well, camera shake can occur when you go to take a photo, and as you press the shutter button, it can cause a slight shake in your camera, which can result in blurry images. Okay, moving on to the next camera setting, and that is aperture. So aperture is this number in the middle here, and simply put, this controls the size of the opening within your lens for light to pass through. And you'll see aperture represented as an f-stop number. So on lenses, you may typically see these f-stop numbers displayed in increments such as f1.4, f2.8, f5.6, and so on. So the thing to remember is the lower this f number is, the wider the opening within your lens will be, which will lead to a brighter image. And the higher this number, the smaller of the opening of your lens becomes, which will lead to a darker image. Now, the second function that aperture controls is the depth of field in your images. So you may be thinking, what is depth of field? And well, depth of field basically refers to how much of the image will be in focus. So for example, if you put your hand around 15 centimeters in front of your face and focus on the lines on your palm, you'll start to notice that in your peripheral vision, everything around your hand is blurry and out of focus. So in photography, we call this a shallow depth of field. And this background blur is referred to as bokeh, and it's the same type of effect a lens with a low aperture of something like f2.8 can produce. It's also the same type of effect that is happening when using the portrait mode feature on your smartphones. So depending on what your subject is, you may want to use a shallow depth of field where there'll be a nice smooth background blur, or you may want to use a deep depth of field to ensure as much of your image is in focus. So some examples of having a shallow depth of field could be when shooting portraits or product photography. And some examples of using a higher aperture, so something like f11 and up, could be when shooting landscapes or architecture. Okay, now lastly, we have ISO. And this setting can be found on the right hand side of your camera here, and this controls the sensitivity of your camera sensor. So simply put, the higher the ISO you use, the brighter your image will become. But since your camera is adding light to your image artificially, this will cause digital grain to appear in your images. So whenever you are manually setting your ISO, try to always keep it as low as possible to ensure you're capturing the cleanest image possible. But with that being said, there will be times where you will be shooting in a dark area, so you may need to crank this number up, and I believe it's better to get the shot with a little grain than not to take the photo at all. So these three settings all work together to determine your exposure, and I've left a copy of this cheat sheet in the description below to help you while you are out shooting to remember what each of these settings control. But whenever I manually expose my images, I always set my shutter speed and aperture first, depending on my subject, and I always set my ISO last. So for example, if my main goal of my image is to freeze the motion, I will first set my shutter speed to whatever I need to freeze my subject. So for this photo, that was 1/1000th of a second. Next, I will adjust my aperture to balance out the light and to ensure I control what will be in focus. So for this image, that was f4.0. And if I needed more light, I would then set my ISO last. But since I was shooting outdoors during the day, I was able to keep my ISO at the lowest number, which was ISO 100 for this photo. I know firsthand that all of this can be quite confusing at first, but there are tools that we can use within our cameras to help us nail our exposure every time. So the most common one I'll cover in this video is the histogram. So a histogram is this graph here that reads your exposure in real time and will allow you to see if your photo is too bright, which will mean all the information will go on the right like this, or too dark, which will push all the information over to the left hand side like this. So there's been many occasions that I've experienced where I'd look at the LCD screen on my camera and the image I've just taken looks correctly exposed, but once I transferred the files to my computer, the photo was either overexposed or underexposed. And this could be due to your LCD screen's brightness level, also the small screen size on your camera, and also different lighting situations around you can affect getting a 100% correct preview. So you can't always trust your LCD screen, especially on sunny days where it's a bit difficult to view your screen. So the histogram is a great way while out shooting to ensure your exposure is correct. In most shooting situations, you want all the information to be spread out evenly and sitting somewhere in the middle. But with that being said, there will be cases out in the field where the lighting conditions won't be on your side. So a pro tip is to expose more for the highlights, which will cause your photo to be slightly underexposed. And we do this because when editing, it is a lot easier to bring back information in your shadows than it is your highlights. So a lot of beginner photographers tend to overexpose their images, so be sure to watch your histogram the next time you're out shooting. Okay, so the next setting we're going to be covering is white balance. And personally, I use the auto white balance feature for majority of my images, but different cameras will provide better or worse results when using this auto option. So I highly suggest understanding your camera's white balance settings to ensure no issues occur while out in the field. But with that being said, if you're shooting in RAW, which I suggest all photographers to do, you can adjust your white balance in the editing room. So a rule of thumb when shooting outside in direct daylight, you want to manually set your white balance to anywhere between 5200 to 6000 Kelvin depending on the time of day. And when you are shooting indoors and only using artificial lighting, you usually want to be between 3 and 4000 Kelvin depending on the lights used in the room. And if you don't know what Kelvin is, it's basically a scale for measuring the different temperatures found in different sources of light. So with Kelvin, each temperature is given a number, so when manually setting your white balance by Kelvin, all you have to do is determine the light you are shooting in and dial in the correct temperature from the Kelvin numbers on the screen. And just remember that our goal when manually setting the white balance is to make sure the whites in our image are white. So if the whites are looking too yellow, then your white balance is too warm. And if the whites are looking blue, then your white balance is too cool. But like I said before, depending on the camera you are using, you may be able to get away with using the auto white balance feature majority of the time. Plus, if you're shooting in RAW, this can easily be fixed in the editing room. But again, I highly recommend at least having a basic idea on manually setting your white balance to ensure no surprises while you're out shooting. Again, I've left a link to this Kelvin chart for you to download and keep as a reference while you're out in the field. Okay, now let's move on to the last camera setting we need to understand to capturing professional looking images, and that is focus. Nailing your focus is so important because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how well composed your image is or how good the lighting is. If your photo is out of focus, then it's simply not usable. And as you start to learn, you will quickly realize that focus is the only thing we cannot fix in the editing room. So firstly, we need to understand that focus is broken down into two categories. So focus modes and focus areas. So let's break these two down, starting with focus modes. So most cameras will have at least 3 different focusing modes within them. Number 1 is AFS, also known as single shot. And this is the focus mode we use when shooting subjects that aren't moving. So things like products, landscapes, and architecture. Number 2 is AFC/servo, also known as continuous autofocus. And this is the focus mode we use when shooting moving subjects. So things like cars, animals, and people. So when your camera is in the continuous autofocus mode, as long as you hold down the shutter button halfway, our cameras will constantly be updating the focus. So as you can see here, the focus is constantly staying on me as I move around the frame. Okay, moving on to the last focus mode, and that is manual focus. So this is when we are in total control of setting the focus, and we can do this by twisting the focus ring on our lens. So personally, I use autofocus 99% of the time, and I only ever use manual focus in situations where my camera may struggle setting the focus. So for example, when shooting through a fence or in really low light situations. Alright, now let's cover focus areas. So all cameras have a number of focus points where the camera's autofocus can catch on to. So within your camera settings, there are some options where you can choose which autofocus points are active at any given time. And some cameras may have these under different names or even offer more options, but let's run through the focus areas that should be on most cameras. So number 1 is wide. So this mode, the camera analyzes everything on the screen and will catch focus onto whatever's closest to the camera or whatever stands out the most in your scene. So the wide mode can work great when your subject is easily visible and when there isn't too many other objects or things that could potentially compete with your subject. Next is zone. So this mode is perfect for setting your focus area to a certain part of your scene. So for example, if your subject is on one side of your frame, in zone focus, we can move the focus area to perfectly sit on our subject. So I personally prefer using zone focusing over the wide mode because it allows me a bit more control on where I want the camera to focus. Okay, next is center focus. And as the name suggests, the focus area is set to the center of your frame. So this mode can work great when you're trying to capture images with perfect symmetry or when your subject is placed directly in the middle of your frame. Personally, I don't use this mode much because I'd rather use the next focus mode, which is flexible spot. So this mode is used when you are setting the focus to a very specific area and when you want to achieve tack sharp focus. Another reason I prefer using flexible spot is the different options of sizes that are offered. Having these options provides you the flexibility when shooting in different situations. So for example, when shooting with models, I can use the smallest focus option and place that tiny spot on the model's eyes to ensure a tack sharp image. So I know that was quite a bit to take in, but the more you go out and shoot, the more comfortable you'll be in choosing the correct focus mode and area. Alright, so there we have it. Those are the key camera settings we need to dial in to start capturing professional looking photos with any camera. And again, this video is just a sneak peek of what you can expect in my new Photography Accelerator course. And if you want to learn more about it, you can hit the link below this video to take advantage of the early bird access. But with that being said, I want to thank you for making it this far in the training. And as always, if you have any additional questions, please let me know and I'll see you in the next one.